So bright. Just give it a minute before we actually start. I sit way too close to my screen. The thing that causes all the neck problems, every person who's ever worked like a computer job or just uses their computer a lot, I mean, especially in this day and age, you're focused on your screen, and then like as time progresses, you like inch closer and closer to it. And then when you're like in this position, it's like really bad for your neck. Anyway, we just give it a couple minutes before we actually start. It's just microphone. Now you can see it, but that's okay. Maybe bump this down a bit. That way I can slouch a bit in the chair. You still get like at least my full head, right? And like body, right? So. Alrighty. Hello and welcome to the Streaming Parson Reads the Book of Samuel. Today we'll be continuing off where we left off last week, and we'll be starting with chapter 4, which kind of just takes place after like basically the origin story, if you will, of the prophet Samuel. And basically what happens now as we move from chapter 4 is that we see kind of the early prophet life of Samuel. Of course, there's a transition phase, of course, because if you remember from chapter 3, as I talked about last week, God was basically like, okay, before like I can institute my new prophet, I'm going to do a little bit of house cleaning. But, you know, not the basic I tell you my stream schedule kind of housekeeping. I mean like real housekeeping, where God has to kind of purge some really awful priests that are, serving in the house of the Lord. And so God's not happy with these guys, and he's like, well, I'm gonna have someone easily replace these guys. So gotta take out the trash, right? And so that's kind of where we start with chapter 4 today. Anyway, I'll be reading from the New International Version. I don't know why I do this every time, because you can't actually see what version this is unless I go like this or something. And even then, like, the print's pretty small. But anyway, I'll be using the New International Version, or NIV. I hope you can flip to it if you got a Bible, or the easy way of doing things, just, BibleGateway.com on your desktop, Bible app on your phone. I mean, a free Bible, why not use it? But anyway, I'll be using that, the New International Version, if you want to follow, and I encourage you to. If you have questions, just shoot them in the chat. And we're going to just start off with a quick word of prayer, and then we're just going to dive into it and start reading. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for this time that we have to read into your word. And I just pray that as we read your word, you would show us more of who you are and your desires for our lives, and reveal yourself to us in a way that we can know we can trust you, especially in these kind of crazy times that we live in. I just pray this in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. Alrighty, so 1 Samuel chapter 4. Now the Israelites went out to fight against the Philistines. The Israelites camped at Ebenezer, and the Philistines at Aphek. I think that's how you say that. The Philistines deployed their forces to meet Israel, and as the battle spread, Israel was defeated by the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 of them on the battlefield. When the soldiers returned to camp, the elders of Israel asked, "Why did the Lord bring defeat on us today before the Philistines? Let us bring the ark of the Lord's covenant from Shiloh, so that he may go with us and save us from the hand of our enemies." And so the people sent men to Shiloh, and they brought back the ark of the covenant of the Lord Almighty, who was enthroned between the cherubim. And Eli's 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the ark of the covenant of God. Now when the ark of the Lord's covenant came into the camp, all Israel raised such a great shout that the ground shook. Hearing the uproar, the Philistines asked, "What's all this shouting and..." Sorry, wrong voice. I need voice for the Philistines. "What's all this shouting in the Hebrew camp?" When they heard that the ark of the Lord had come into the camp, the Philistines were afraid. "A god has come into the camp," they said. "Oh no, nothing like this has happened before. We are doomed. Who will deliver us from the hand of these mighty gods? They are the gods who struck the Egyptians with all kinds of plagues in the wilderness. Now be strong, Philistines. Be men, or you will be subject to the Hebrews, as they have been to you. Be men and fight." So the Philistines fought, and the Israelites were defeated, and every man fled to his tent. The slaughter was great, and Israel had lost 30,000 foot soldiers. The ark of the covenant was captured, and Eli's 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, died. Verse 12. Now that same day, a Benjamite ran from the battle line and went to Shiloh with his clothes torn and dust on his head. When he arrived, there was Eli sitting on his chair by the side of the road, watching, because his heart feared for the ark of God. Now when the man entered the town and told what had happened, the whole town sent up a cry. Eli heard the outcry and asked, "What is the meaning of this uproar?" And the man hurried over to Eli, who was 98 years old and whose eyes had failed, so he could no longer see. And the man told Eli, I come from the battlefield line, and I fled it from this very day. Eli asked, "What happened, my son?" The man who brought the news replied, "Israel fled before the Philistines, and the army has suffered heavy losses. Also, your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the ark of God has been captured." When he mentioned the ark of God, Eli fell backward off his chair by the side of the gate. His neck was broken, and he died, for he was an old man, and he was heavy. He led Israel for 40 years. Now his daughter-in-law, the wife of Phinehas, was pregnant, and near the time of delivery. When she heard the news that the ark of God had been captured, and that her father-in-law and her husband were dead, she went into labor and gave birth, but was overcome by her labor pains. As she was dying, the women attending her said, "Don't despair, you have given birth to a son." But she did not respond or pay any attention. She named the boy Ichabod, saying, "The glory has departed from Israel," because the capture of the ark of God and the death of her father-in-law and her husband. She said, "The glory hath departed from Israel, for the ark of God has been captured." So chapter 4, just a quick series of events. So basically we had, sorry, I'm just looking at OBS and OBS being kind of silly. It reset the timer. So now it says I've been streaming for like 2 minutes. But anyway, so chapter 4, pretty straightforward, not a long chapter, just kind of tells you, what happened, series of events. And so the first is that Israel is fighting a long contesting enemy of Israel, the Philistines. And if you remember from my reading of the book of Judges, the Philistines had been fighting Israel for like a while, right? Like almost since Israel even moved into Canaan, and the Philistines had been fighting them. Now the Philistines were likely probably somewhere in like southern Europe, as many Bible scholars assume that they have come from overseas. I mean, the only body of water next to the land of Israel would be like the Mediterranean Sea, right? So either the Philistines came kind of south, so from North Africa, or they came from southern Europe. Where they exactly came from, not relevant. But basically, what most people assume happened was that the Philistines, came from one of these two places, and they settled near what is now Gaza, the Gaza Strip. And they had lived there for a while. They had like started building their own settlements, and most archaeologists assume that this was happening actually around the same time that Israel had moved into, the land of Canaan. And so, in a funny sort of way, they're both kind of people wanting to conquer, the land of Canaan, right? And for their own reasons, right? So in Israel's case, God said, "You're going to live here now, so you gotta take it over." And the Philistines also, kind of wanted to migrate to a nice fertile land like Israel. So it's interesting that these two nations had been fighting each other for so long, because I mean you would expect as much after you read like the book of Joshua, and then of course in early Judges as well. Most of the other tribal groups that lived in Canaan had already been wiped out either by Israel or by the Philistines. And so now there's continual battle between Israel and the Philistines, and this will keep being a thing until eventually the Philistines are completely kicked out. Probably during like the Book of Kings times, because you don't hear about them anymore. Uh, Basically, by the time we get to the Book of Kings, now most people would say, well, because David wiped out most of them, which is partly true. But of course, there are other factors of like, areas outside of, Israel, because, Israel's not the only place in the world. There's popular theories that the Philistines, wherever they originated from, so for example, to the north, the the Babylonian Empire was, gaining all this power, and so they could have wiped out the bulk of the Philistines. And of course, if you go with the theory that the Philistines come from North Africa, well, Egypt had to re-expand, which led to the Silver Age of Egypt. If you read your history books, the Silver Age of Egypt would have been about 800 BC ish, because remember, Greece did not become all that powerful yet, and that's why the Syrians are long gone by then. 800 BC, so it would have been around. The Persians would have started coming, but of course the Greeks and the Persians had a war too, right? But that's its own thing to cover later, the Punic Wars. But it is very likely the Philistines would have been wiped out during that time. And so it's either like the Babylonians or even later with the Persians, and then the Philistines would have been wiped out in the crossfire in the Punic Wars. Either way you look at it, basically the Philistines were basically cornered, and that's one reason why they went to um, the Gaza Strip and tried to take over, what is now Israel and Palestine. And the Philistines would have tried to take it over because they were basically backed into a corner. Um, and that is one good reason why, when you read in like the Book of Samuel, you see that the Philistines are so aggressive, right? And they're trying to absolutely destroy the Israelites, because really they were pretty desperate themselves, because they were getting wiped out either by Egypt or by the Persians, depending on which which theory you accept of where they come from, either from Southern Europe or North Africa. So that just leads to the Book of Samuel time, where the Philistines are fighting the Israelites pretty aggressively. And the funny thing in this story is that, you read another part earlier in the Bible that the Israelites had gained so much victory, right? They've beaten up everybody else, like the Ammonites and, the bulk of the Canaanites, the Hittites, and the Jebusites, and all those other ites, right? But now, the Philistines are just like giving Israel a really hard time. Part of it is the desperation idea, which is partly true. That's part of the story. But of course, another part was, Israel was no longer a united people, right? And we read in the Book of Judges, why would they be, right? The people of Israel were kind of just doing whatever they wanted. All the tribes kind of like, well, we just want to live our lives and be left alone. And they became kind of tribal, similar to the people in Canaan, right? Which is one of those funny things where when we were reading Exodus or Judges, and the listing of the people that lived in Canaan, right? It's kind of funny that the Israelites were not that different. Irony, right? So we get to this part in history now. It's like like mostly Judah and Benjamin, because they're the bulk of the southern part of what is Israel. Of course, later the kingdoms get divided, right, with Judah and Israel. I mean, technically, since we're reading the Book of Samuel, the land is still called the land of Canaan, right? So calling it Israel would not be accurate. But in the people living in Israel at the time, they were pretty divided, right? And the Book of the Book of Judges already points that out. And so that's another reason why the Philistines would just be like really kicking Israel's ass, because Israel was so divided, right? And they had no strategic leadership, even though like they were able to amass a large army, but there wasn't this kind of unity among the Israelites to really fight back the Philistines. And perhaps another thing too, that while the Bible doesn't exactly say this, this is a fair assumption to make, is that it is more than likely that the Israelites kind of became too dependent on the judges, if you will, right? And we read when we read through the book of Judges, we saw that like there there were these sporadic episodes that God would deliver Israel, and perhaps after God doing it so many times, the people kind of just expected it, right? Which is a dangerous way of thinking, right? The idea that like, well, God will just make a miracle for us because that's what he does. But, you know, if you remember back in chapter 2, and we were talking about Hannah and her, her poem or whatever you want to call it, her song. And, she acknowledges that God doesn't have to do anything, which is kind of a darker way of looking at, how God behaves, right? That God really doesn't have to do anything. And there are times like this where he doesn't, right? Of course, it's so easy to criticize God in those instances where he's like, well, why doesn't he do anything, right? Does he not love the people of Israel? Does he not care about his covenant with Abraham, right? Why doesn't he do something then? Why doesn't he just directly intervene? But of course, we read in the earlier chapters that there was a fair amount of corruption in the church, and God was allowing, Israel down this thorny path, and leading to all this death and destruction to kind of weed out, some of this the problematic elements of, Israel's divisiveness, and just letting Israel suffer for their own actions, right? Because the rationale that can be used is that, like, well, if a person decides to do very terrible things, they should, more often than not, there doesn't have to be an outside force to punish them for that, right? An example of this, I know this is like this is a terrible example, but you're on the streaming Parson channel. I use extremes more often than not. But you think of like drug addiction in general, right? You don't really need like outside law enforcement to really punish a person who's addicted to drugs, because more often than not, those people will destroy their own lives. It is just a natural consequence of when you do bad things, right? Of course, I have to put that in quotes because somebody's going to say, well, doing drugs isn't that bad, until, you realize how many lives it destroys. But, you get the point, right? Like, the actions will make their own consequences. And so, God's inactivity, if you will, is kind of God's way of just allowing, like, the people to suffer for their actions, right? Because if we do things, right, we have to get the consequences, and more often than not, when we commit sin has repercussions, right? One thing that's interesting as you read through chapter 4, though, with that being said, one of the things that's actually kind of funny is when the Philistines see the Ark of the Covenant, right? And they, for lack of better words, they become, their superstitious mindset kind of comes to the forefront. They're like, oh, the gods have come, right? And so, ironically, the Philistines think that, like, well, God is going to do something, right? That God is actually going to do an action against them now that Israel has brought the ark. But of course, what we end up seeing is that God is inactive in the story. He decides not to do anything. And I just kind of find it ironic how the Philistines develop this fear, right? And they're like, oh no, right? The gods of the Israelites have come. And of course, God's reputation has superseded him, right? Where, everybody knows that God is the one that had committed all these actions, uh, even atrocities, if you want to call it that, in Egypt, right? Where killing the firstborn of all of Egypt and, destroying millions, right? And so the Philistines are like, well, you know, we're just chump change, right? If God can do that, which they would be if God decided to do anything. But we see that God is inactive here because he wanted, you know, Israel to face the consequences, right? And I would even go so far as to say that, like, you know, God wanted Israel to suffer for, their lack of faith, as well as, you know, their corruption, right? God wanted them to face the consequences and even suffer for it, because it's only fair, right? Because that's real. Is if in all retrospect, that is real fairness, right? You reap what you sow, is as the old saying goes. Just a couple of little notes about chapter 4. There's not much else to say about it. So we just have the Israelites bringing the ark. Well, I guess we could talk about this a little bit and why. The story kind of treats it like yeah, it's just part of the story, if you will. But you have to kind of understand the logic that people would have used, and it's really not that different from what people do today. Like, you may read this part of the story and you'd be like, well, this is kind of like a primitive way of thinking. But at the same time, it's really not. It's one of those, human condition things, right? Human beings just think like this, right? It doesn't matter what era you live in, we just do this. And this is in regard to Israel bringing the Ark of the Covenant, right? As, like, you know, a good luck charm, right? And how just because they brought the Ark of the Covenant, it will give them their victory against the Philistines. Of course, you know, as modern readers, we would easily see, like, oh yeah, this is just a idiotic, superstition, right? This is clearly not going to work, and as we see, it clearly doesn't. But you got to understand, like, the way people used to think back then, right? And the Philistines kind of, once again, they kind of reinforce this idea is that, you know, wars and battles were not merely like men fighting for political reasons or stuff like that, right? But rather, wars were fought as human beings were the playthings of gods. And so, anytime there was a war or a battle, the real battle is not a physical battle, but some kind of meta battle between the gods, quote unquote, right? And so, when Israel brings the Ark of the Covenant, they've kind of bought into this idea. And so they're like, well, God will fight for us, right? And, that's the whole reason why they went to Shiloh to go get the Ark, right? Because they think that bringing this box is going to change things, right? But, as I mentioned earlier, if God is going to be inactive, bringing a magic box isn't going to do anything, right? And so it's the lack of perspective of whether they really had the presence of God. It goes to show that this is the lack of, how do I put it, the lack of communion and relationship that the Israelites had with God, right? They kind of treated God like the magic 8 ball, right? Like basically he's treated like the genie from Aladdin, right? God grant me my magic wishes, right? That's kind of how he's treated here when the Israelites bring the ark. And the Philistines' reaction is, you know, reinforces that this is kind of the mindset of the ancient world. Of course, as moderns, we think this is ridiculous, but, you know, more often than not, we as people tend to have our, our rituals, our daily rituals of how we think. If you think about it, like, when people do, like, positivity chants or whatever, right? To make themselves feel better and self-esteem boost. And there's nothing wrong with those things in themselves, right? Like you want to bump up your self-esteem and you do little ritual things for yourself to prep yourself for the day, if you will. Nothing wrong with them in themselves. But of course, the problem that Israel had here, and an easy temptation for us, is that we make those the end all be all, and we kind of treat it as like, how do I put it? We make those things more important than God, right? And that's where, God talks about like the tradition superseding, God's, commands, if you will, right? When we read in the New Testament, the traditions, the people love the traditions more than God, stuff like that, right? And this is one of those cases where people had loved the tradition more than they loved God. And so they thought the tradition would save them, bring in the Ark of the Covenant. It worked for Joshua for every battle he was in. It worked in the book of Judges. Why would it not work here, right? But it shows the disconnect that Israel had with God, and that they relied more on the superstitious tradition as opposed to, trusting in God himself. Okay, now the tirade is over. I'm just gonna go over some notes that you can pick up in the text, just a little nitpicky literature things. So the first one is, well, the first thing I want to point out is kind of this funny thing where you're reading in the part where Eli's sitting on the chair next to the reverend, and he's kind of like how do I put it? He's supposed to be a monitor of the city. He's kind of like he's a gatekeeper. It's basically what he is. But of course, the big irony is that his eyesight is absolutely terrible, right? Because the Bible points out he's like 98 years old and his eyes are failing him, right? And he's still the gatekeeper, which is interesting to read, right? From a literary standpoint, it really shows the blindness of Israel, right? Because if this old guy, whose eyesight is basically garbage, is the gatekeeper, your society is boned, right? And so that's kind of the Eli is the microcosm of the bigger problem I just talked about, right? When I was talking about like Israel and their superstition as opposed to loving God and obeying his commandments, right? Eli is a microcosm of this, as we see from an individual perspective of spiritual blindness, right? Because the rational person in you is probably thinking, and I thought this too, where it's like, well, who the hell is, like, why isn't there an actual gatekeeper that's competent, right? Why isn't there one? What the heck, right? But it shows that like maybe people were not interested, or people were just too busy to care or whatever, right? Which is one of those things where like a gatekeeper's job is really important, right? Especially in the ancient world. I mean, today is just as important, right? Airport security is just the modern day gatekeeper, right? Or border security, right? The modern day gatekeeper. Imagine if you were like, if you, imagine that you had seen like a border guard that was like some old guy couldn't move and was blind, right? And then a bunch of guys smuggling drugs over the border, and but the border guard's blind, so he can't see anything, right? Like, how useful is that, right? How screwed would you be, right? But that's kind of one of the funny things when you see Eli here, and he's the gatekeeper, right? Even though he's old, he's weak, and he's blind. Now you find these kind of things in a lot of other literature, right? This, the symbolism of eyes and being able to see things, right? Vision, and how important vision is. Not just on a physical level, clearly is important on a physical level, but on a spiritual level as well, right? If you're willfully blind, if you're unable to see, or unwilling to see, right? And of course, Eli's blindness goes in tandem with his willful blindness, right? As we talked about in the earlier chapters, in chapter 3, we had the whole like corruption that was happening in the church, quote unquote, because the church didn't exist back then. You know what I meant. But the corruption with like Eli's own sons, right? And Eli was willfully blind, and here we have him being physically blind, but he's still the one that's watching the city. Ironic, right? But this passage, as you read about the blind man being the gatekeeper, is a good reminder for us that we how dangerous it is to not be attentive, or to allow our ability to be attentive to wane, right? Because what happens next, right? This guy shows up, and Eli asks him, "Yo, man, what's up? You know, why are you here?" And the guy tells him all the bad news. Your sons are dead. The Ark of the Covenant is gone, right? And then Eli breaks his neck because he's also fat, right? And he's Eli. What's interesting in this scene is that Eli is the embodiment of absolute incompetence, right? He's blind as a gatekeeper. He's supposed to be, like, as a gatekeeper, you're also a messenger, right? Because, the messenger comes and then the gatekeeper has to relay the message of the messenger. But yet he's fat, so it means he's fat and slow and immobile, right? So he is basically the embodiment of incompetence. But it makes sense when you think about it like that, right? And how, because of his, Eli's incompetence, that's where so much corruption comes from. And you go like, yeah, God needed to clearly clean this out, right? And bring up someone new to be the leader of Israel. Then we have this last part, which is kind of like the really moment where where the story shifts to this character who has like a few verses about her whole story is in a few verses, right? And it's does she even have a name? I don't think she has a name. She's just the wife of Phineas, and Phineas is one of these mega dickbag priests that not only steals the offering sacrifice meat, but also has been sleeping around with the tent girls or whatever, right? Basically, last week I made the awful illustration or parallel to like those the the worship band member who's like sleeping with a girl from the youth group kind of thing. Like Phineas is one of those guys, right? One of the scumbags that justify people's reasons not to go to church. Phineas is one of those. And then he has a wife. What's going on here, right? But it was that kind of terrible thing was going on back then like it does now, unfortunately, right? But crappy human beings are going to be crappy human beings. But anyway, so the story shifts to Phineas's wife, and she has this kid, and then like so many people die this day, right? So we had like 30,000 guys die in a fight, including Hophni and Phineas. Then Eli dies because he falls over and then breaks his neck. And now Phineas's wife like dies from a broken heart. Really? Your heart breaks for this guy? Like that's just pathetic. But maybe she was ignorant of like the whole thing. I mean, I don't know if that would be possible, but maybe that just adds on to Eli's willful blindness, right? But anyway, this woman dies of a broken heart because her husband's dead, even though he's a scumbag human being. And then she names the kid like Ichabod, which has like a terrible meaning, right? God's departure is a more accurate way of translating it. But the Bible tells it pretty well, right? It means the glory the glory has departed from Israel. And then she dies, right? So chapter 4, we got a real feel-good chapter, right? Lots of people die. And the Ark of the Covenant has, been stolen by the Philistines. So that's how we start today's reading. Great, right? But I mean, to be fair, this is the book of Samuel, right? There's a reason why you don't hear as many sermons on the book of Samuel, because there's not a lot of cheery stories out of it. The book of Samuel is a wild ride from cover to cover. Let's just take a short break before reading on to chapter 5. All right, chapter 5. After the Philistines had captured the Ark of God, they took it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. Then they carried the ark into Dagon's temple and set it beside Dagon. When the people of Ashdod rose early the next day, there was Dagon, fallen on his face on the ground before the ark of the Lord. They took Dagon and put him back up in his place. But the following morning they rose, and there was Dagon, fallen on his face on the ground before the ark of the Lord. His head and his hands were broken off and were lying on the threshold, and only his body remained. And that is why to this day neither the priests of Dagon nor any others who enter Dagon's temple at Ashdod step on the threshold. Now the Lord's hand was heavy on the people of Ashdod and its vicinity. He brought devastation on them and afflicted them with tumors. Yikes. When the people of Ashdod saw what was happening, they said, "The ark of God of Israel must not stay here with us, because his hand is heavy on us and on Dagon our God." So they called together the rulers of the Philistines and asked them, "What shall we do with the ark of the God of Israel?" And they answered, "Have the ark of God of Israel moved to Gath." So they moved the ark of God to Gath. But after they had moved it, the Lord's hand was against that city, throwing it into a great panic. He afflicted the people of the city, both young and old, with an outbreak of tumors. So they sent the ark of God to Ekron. As the ark of God was entering Ekron, the people of Ekron cried out, "They have brought the ark of God of Israel around us to kill us and our people." So they called together all the rulers of the Philistines and said, "Send the ark of God away and let it go back to its own people, or it will kill us and our people." For death had filled the city with panic. God's hand was very heavy on it, and those who did not die were afflicted with tumors, and the outcry of the city went up to heaven. So, chapter 5. It's a pretty short chapter, but it's pretty straightforward. So basically, the Philistines are kind of like, we got, the Ark of God as a trophy, right? Let's just kind of keep it in our temple and, just sit there as a trophy. And, we can laugh about how we kicked Israel's ass. But then, of course, God's like, well, I guess it's time for me to do something about this. So he afflicts the Philistines with plagues, right? Which is interesting. An interesting way of doing it, right? Because God uses more, nature, right? Which makes sense that God would use, how do I put it? He would use nature to kind of fight his enemies, right? And there's a pretty simple rationale of why God does this more often than not. God using nature as opposed to like, what the Israelites thought when they brought the Ark of the Covenant, and then, the Israelites would win the fight. And the rationale is simply this, that if God simply just used people to win his battles, similar to like how other cultures view, warfare, right? And I kind of mentioned this already, but it would it would get to the people's heads, right? That, well, it was the people of God that won the fight and not God himself, right? And of course, there's an interesting contrast here where, there's the Philistine god of Dagon, right? And this statue that keeps falling over, right? And the people have to put it back up. And so, you know, Dagon being an idol and has no real power of his own, his power is the people, right? And so that's, many preachers talk about like the self-reliance of, if God just used human means to do things, then we would just say, well, I did it, right? It was by my own power, right? And some people will take it to the extreme where it's like, well, God only has power because I have power, right? Which is kind of the contrast that's shown with Dagon, right? Dagon is, as an idol, he can't do anything. It's a big block of stone, right? And then of course, Dagon doesn't get up on his own, right? The people have to put up the idol back up. But of course, while the Bible doesn't show us, the assumption is that God was the one that makes Dagon fall over, right? Before people try to make up conspiracies that like, well, no, there was probably some troll that kept pushing the Dagon statue down. Of course, the easy debunk to that idea would be, well, why would they do that, right? You could be executed for that, right? Think back to like the Gideon story, right? When Gideon was vandalizing, the pagan god statue, right? The people were willing to execute him, right? Because that would have been a serious crime. So you can't really make the argument that like, well, someone just pushed the Dagon statue over to make God look like he had power, but that doesn't make any real rational sense, right? That means the entire city would have to be in on the conspiracy, which means that, the rest of the story wouldn't make sense, right? Or at least enough people would have to be in on the conspiracy. But then the rest of the story wouldn't make sense, right? Because all those people would be committing a very serious crime. So this, the simple explanation that the Bible gives us is that, well, God did it, right? Because God is, he is capable of fighting his own battles, right? Which is a major contrast to the ancient world idea of how people, as I mentioned earlier, with people fighting for the gods, right? And that's why wars were the way they were. But here, God does the complete opposite, right? He does not fight for Israel in a battle of men, but the only time God fights is for himself, right? God fights for himself. Which, you can make the argument that makes him a little bit self-absorbed. But at the same time, I mean, the rational person would also be like, well, I mean, like, if God has already been dishonored by the people and people neglecting their worship of God, then why would God fight for them, right? I mean, you wouldn't do things for people if all they did was like ignore you and disregard your presence and disregard your commands and stuff like that. You wouldn't fight for those people, right? You'd be like, you just give them the finger and then be like, do it yourself, right? You think you're so great. That's what you would do. And, in a funny way, that's something we acquire from God. I mean, God, it's not that God is petty like us, but rather, the rationale of why would I fight for people who have no regard for me, is a completely rational way of doing things. And God had given us that kind of thinking as part of his own rationale. That's kind of how we should look at that. And so God doesn't fight for the people when they're kind of doing like the tradition of it. But of course, in this scene, he fights for himself just to prove who he is, right? So that's that's the way to get around where people may think, well, this is kind of a silly scene. But once again, you have to contrast chapter 5 with chapter 4, right? That God doesn't fight for the people, but he fights for himself in chapter 5, right? And, how does he do that? He uses nature, and then with nature, he instills fear, right? He instills fear into the Philistines, which in a way is far more effective as well, right? Because maybe God's thinking the long game, right? If you're thinking from like a tactical war perspective, there's a long game to be played here that maybe God is playing. And so by instilling fear into the Philistines, that is more impactful. That part I'm kind of extrapolating on. I'm kind of guessing that part. But that it makes total sense for that to be the case as well. So it's a good enough theory, I guess. Yeah, not much else to say about chapter 5. We just get the series of events where the Philistines are like, we don't want this box here anymore. It's kind of screwing over our lives. You know, I love the part where their first idea is just to send it to another town. What were they thinking it was going to be any different? I mean, it's ironic, and this is one of the funny ironies of the story, right? Is that the Philistines, understand the fear of God more than the Israelites, the people of God, right? The Philistines understand God more than the Israelites do, which is ironic, right? But once again, of course, the story uses this as a reminder to us that, like, just because you claim to believe in God or whatever, that doesn't, you can't just believe that. You have to live it, right? You have to, to believe that is more than just a cognitive thing, but rather it's a way you live. And it's ironic that the superstitious Philistines are the ones who know what that means, right? To believe in God, even though for the Philistines, it's kind of in a more antagonistic way, right? They see God as this like powerful enemy that they don't want to deal with, right? But with that being said, now here we are in 2021, the same choices are presented before us, right? That do we believe in God and like, to trust who he is and to be faithful to his plan of healing and salvation to us, or are we going to be antagonistic and be like, get away from me, right? Which is what the Philistines clearly chose. But as you can see, there's going to be other problems with that for them later. But this is a very real thing that we all have to think about as well, right? How we approach God. With that being said, talk about, the Philistines now wanting to send the Ark of God away. We're going to move on to chapter 6, which is the next part of the plan, right? Because moving it to another town clearly didn't work. So let's see what smart idea they come up with next. Chapter 6. When the ark of the Lord had been in Philistine territory for 7 months, the Philistines called for the priests and the diviners and said, "What shall we do with the ark of the Lord? Tell us how we should send it back to its place." And they answered, "If you return the ark of the God of Israel, do not send it back to him without a gift. By all means, send a guilt offering to him. Then you will be healed, and you will know why his hand has not been lifted from you." And the Philistines asked, "What guilt offering should we send him?" And they replied, 5 gold tumors and 5 gold rats, according to the number of the Philistine rulers, because the same plague has struck both you and your rulers. Make models of the tumors and of the rats that are destroying the country, and give glory to Israel's God. Perhaps he will lift his hand from you and your gods and your land. Why do you harden your hearts as the Egyptians and Pharaoh did? When Israel's God dealt harshly with them, did they not send out Israel so they could go on their way? Now then, get a new cart ready with 2 cows that have calved and have never been yoked. Hitch the cows to the cart, but take their calves away and pen them up. Take the ark of the Lord and put it on the cart, and in a chest beside it put the gold object you are sending back to him as a guilt offering. Send it on its way, but keep watching it. If it goes up to its own territory, toward Beth Shemesh, then the Lord has brought this great disaster on us. But if it does not, then we will know that it was not his hand that struck us, but that it happened to us by chance. So they did this, and they took 2 such cows and hitched them to the cart and penned up their calves. They placed the ark of the Lord on the cart, and along with its chest, containing the gold rats and models of the tumors. Then the cows went straight up toward Beth Shemesh, keeping on the road and lowing all the way. They did not turn to the right or to the left. And the rulers of the Philistines followed them as far as the border of Beth Shemesh. Now the people of Beth Shemesh were harvesting in the valley, and when they looked up and saw the ark, they rejoiced at the sight. The cart came to the field of Joshua of Beth Shemesh, and there it stopped beside a large rock. The people chopped up the wood on the cart and sacrificed the cows as burnt offerings to the Lord. The Levites took down the ark of the Lord, together with the chest containing the gold objects, and placed them on the large rock. On that day, the people of Beth Shemesh offered burnt offerings and made sacrifices to the Lord. The 5 rulers of the Philistines saw all this, and they returned home to Ekron. These are the gold tumors the Philistines sent as a guilt offering to the Lord, 1 each to Ashdod, Gaza, Ashkelon, Gath, and Ekron. And the number of gold rats was according to the number of Philistine towns belonging to the 5 rulers. The fortified towns with their country villages, the large rock on which the Levites set the ark of the Lord, is a witness to this day in the field of Joshua of Beth Shemesh. But God struck down some of the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh, putting 70 of them to death, because they looked upon the ark of the Lord. The people mourned because of the heavy blow the Lord had dealt to them. And the people of Beth Shemesh asked, "Who can stand in the presence of the Lord, this holy God? To whom will the ark go up from here?" Then they sent messengers to the people of Kiriath-Jearim, saying, "The Philistines have returned the ark of the Lord. Come down and take it up to your town." I need a better table here to put my book down when I need to put it down. So chapter 7, chapter 6. Once again, more series of events, and I feel like that's going to be the bulk of the chapters for today and even tomorrow. Or next week, I mean. Wow, did I really just say tomorrow? Anyway, so chapter 6, right? So basically, we have the Philistines, and they're like, okay, you know what? We're tired of having this box around. And something that's kind of funny is that like the Bible even points out that like the Philistines had this thing for 7 months. Are you telling me that for 7 months these people were willing to endure all the suffering that God kept bringing them? 7 months is a pretty long time, right? Especially in the ancient world, because in today's day and age, like it's how do I? It's hard to explain this, but because of how technology has made like our lives way simpler, as far as like, you know, the ancient world, everybody's like a farmer, shepherd, or, a lot of hard work in the ancient world compared to like us and maintaining the internet as like the bulk of people's jobs. And of course, like the stakes were higher if you failed at farming in the ancient world. So that's what I mean by like the work was harder, right? Because the stakes were kind of higher. Whereas today, if, let's say like for example, the place I work at, one of the places I work at anyway, is food packing. If like that place went closed for a day, I don't think the world would like the people in Vancouver wouldn't care that much, right? It's not a big deal in the grand scheme of things, right? If every McDonald's was closed today, I don't think it would matter in the grand scheme of things, right? If one farm today was burned down, it wouldn't like, I mean, it would devastate a few people's livelihoods, but like the bulk of society would be fine, right? It wasn't like in the ancient world where, if a farm goes down, you're kind of in deep crap because of how, you know, the scarcity of food and stuff like that in the ancient world. But anyway, where was I going with this? Oh yeah, so for 7 months, to go 7 months of like the more tedious and rougher work life of people in the ancient world, and on top of that, now God is like making people have tumors and stuff and making people suffer. I mean, you got to give points to the Philistines that like to endure that for 7 months, like that's hardcore, right? If God were to do that to us today, we'd be like crying after like the first week, and be like, "No, stop!" Right? We'd be doing that in the first week, but 7 months. I mean, these Philistines got some balls, so you gotta give them points for that. But anyway, the Philistines finally come up with like a good idea for a change, right? Instead of like the stupid idea in chapter 5, which is like, oh, let's just move it to a different town. And they expected something to, they expected it to turn out differently. But here, their brilliant plan was that like, why don't we just send it back to Israel? Like, it's their God, it's their ark, it's their problem, right? Why don't we just send the box back to them? And they do, right? And of course, like the diviners are all like, yeah, maybe we should give them a gift offering too, because we want to be nice. We want to, say that there's relative, like a peace treaty, right? For now, right? Which once again is kind of a funny thing to think about as we read through these chapters, these Philistine episodes, because there's this hilarious kind of contrast between Israel's lack of faith and the Philistines, even though it's kind of construed, but their real faith and their real understanding of God. Or as the Bible would say it, they have an actual fear of God, right? That the Philistines have an actual fear of God, whereas Israel's kind of become somewhat complacent with God, as we read in Judges, and of course, the corruption with Eli and his family. It's just one of those funny things that like, and maybe this is where if pastors are not often using bad examples to, bad extreme examples rather, to get points across, are we even reading the same Bible? Because like, really, the Bible does this all the time. And I think it's actually kind of hilarious that the Bible does this like all the time. Right? It's always these like ridiculously bad extreme examples that kind of get a point across. Where it's like, yeah, that's these Philistines that get it, right? It's these Philistines that get what it means to have reverence and fear of God, right? even though they act relatively negative toward it as well, right? Because we don't read that the Philistines convert or become believers of God. They just acknowledge, you know, God more than the Israelites do, and they show a real fear of that, right? Whereas the Israelites are kind of like, yeah, whatever, God, whatever, right? Which is kind of one of those things where, you know, we see that in the world today as well, unfortunately, right? A lot of people that, you know, we live in a place that's like, how is this not a miracle of God? Yet so many people are just like quick to kind of ignore God, right? But it's these Philistines that acknowledge who God is and they show a real reverence and fear of Him, right? And they're like, yeah, you know, we're gonna give a peace offering to the Israelites, right? Because they understand that, like, well, if we're gonna, you know, we know we've disrespected your God, so we're gonna change that mindset, right? We're not gonna disrespect your God. At least these guys don't, anyways, because we read a few years later that the Philistines forget, and then they challenge the people of God again, but that's besides the point. And there's a, you know, things are different by then, right? And of course, the way the story tells it is also shifted. But when you're reading these chapters, the funny thing to think about is that God is ironically using the Philistines to display real faith, as opposed to the Israelites, right? So I always that's one reason why the Book of Samuel is pretty hilarious, right? And it uses, you know, these Philistines to get this point across. Of course, then we move on to when the ark is brought to Beth Shemesh, and you know the Israelites there. There's still this kind of like not a real fear of God, right? And this brings up something like since the Bible never talks about this, it makes people wonder, and you know, at the very least, it makes me wonder. But once I say it, you're gonna wonder too. But how did the Philistines know how to handle the ark, right? Because if you read in the book of Exodus and then you read again in Joshua, the book of the Ark of the Covenant was to be handled very delicately, right? So, for example, there are like these golden rings on it, and you put the acacia wood, you know, these poles basically through it, and then you have to carry it by the poles. You cannot touch the ark any other way, or else you would die, right? That was kind of what God told the Israelites back in Exodus. How would how would the Philistines know this, right? How would the Philistines know how to treat this ark, right? Because remember, back in chapter 5, they kind of treated it like it was just a trophy, right? So how would they have known not to like touch it certain ways? And of course, there were other things in regard to the Ark of the Covenant. And if any of you have ever seen Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark, which obviously, you know, treated the Ark of the Covenant like it was some kind of magic weapon. So if you ever seen that movie, it's an old movie. Maybe some of you younger guys are like, "What's Indiana Jones?" But in Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark, basically, the premise of it is Indiana Jones. He wants to find it for archaeological purposes, but of course the Nazis also want to get the Ark of the Covenant because, you know, the Nazis being superstitious want to use its magic powers. But of course, you know, the Big Bang Theory also makes fun of this movie because Indiana Jones basically, if he was not in the movie at all, the outcome would be the same. Which once again brings the question with the Philistines, right? How would they know how to treat the Ark of the Covenant? It's kind of this, once again, an ironic thing. Contrast with like Israel's disregard to the Ark and kind of treating it like a lucky charm, and how the Philistines actually treat this box with actual respect, at least after it starts causing trouble for them. But if you remember in Indiana Jones, what happens is the Nazis actually get their hands on it, right? Indiana Jones is, he's subdued by the Nazis and they tie him up. And then they're kind of taunting him. They're like, haha, you know, you've lost, Indiana Jones. And now we're going to use this magic weapon on you, right? And we're going to open the Ark of the Covenant, right? And you will be the first to witness the power we have obtained, right? And so the Nazis, these guys open the box, and then like this light comes out, and it just incinerates the Nazis that are there, right? And Indiana Jones is just kind of sitting there watching this all happen. And then after the magic light that comes out kills all the Nazis, the box magically closes itself up, and then Indiana Jones finally breaks free, and he's like, "Well, damn, right? Like that was unexpected." Right? But I thought about that movie scene because, like, once again, how would the Philistines know how to treat the box, right? Like, wouldn't the first thing to do once you've taken this box was to open the box and see what was in it? And yet, well, the Bible never tells us this. This is where crazy minds like mine think about this way too much, clearly. But you know, they opened the did a Philistine like did any of the Philistines open the box? And if they did, was that maybe what caused like all the tumors and stuff that like maybe God's like, hey, don't touch my box, right? Maybe that's what started it all, and the Bible simply doesn't tell us that. Or how do the Philistines know not to directly touch the box later once they know what it really is, right? And how the heck did they get this thing onto the cart without the right acacia wood unless they figured that out somehow, right? Once again, it's like somehow this happened, right? And maybe God brought a revelation to pagan diviners, which is also ironic, but this wouldn't be the first time God does it, especially in the book of Samuel, right? God brings a revelation to a pagan diviner. That could be a possibility, right? And it's just kind of one of those things that makes you think about like how did the Philistines know how to treat the box? And of course, when they send the box back to the Israelites, and they handle it with so much care. But then the funny thing is that the irony is that the Israelites still don't show as much regard as the Philistines do. Which is like, what? Huh? Really? But then we get to, there's these guys that kind of like, well, the Bible's not really totally clear, but they're like, did they look at the box with discontent? Were they just kind of like, treating the box like a superstitious like altar thing? Like it's not clear, but basically there's these like Israelite guys that look at the box and then they die from it, right? By looking at it, right? How did the Philistines not suffer the same wrath, right? But it goes to kind of show this irony of like, even after what had happened, right? Losing the ark to the Philistines and then the Philistines bringing it back, they still don't have that same reverence for God. They don't have the fear of God in them. That's what the Bible perhaps is getting at. But once again, it just kind of makes the irony even more hilarious that the Philistines somehow figured this out. And Israel, the people of God, don't. It's just one of those funny things to think about as you read chapter 6 and reread it yourself, because this is like a bizarre story, right? We have to read it in tandem with like 4 and 5, right? And the complete disregard that Israel has, right? But perhaps this is part of what God is showing us, the reader, at the very least, how dangerous it is to disregard God, right? And using the Ark of the Covenant as kind of the example of the story, right? And how different people approach this box. I just realized that like I think I'm gonna read chapter 7 and then we'll end the stream, because I just realized that like the next part It's like its own arc. So if you're today's, for today's chapters 4, 5, and 6, 4, 5, 6, and now 7, we'll kind of treat this as the arc of the Covenant and Philistines arc, which I know I haven't referred to certain parts of the Bible this way. Oh no, that's not true. In the Book of Judges, I had a couple of those, right? Like this, the Samson arc kind of thing. But basically, I'm going to just read chapter 7, and this will end the arc of the Covenant and Philistines arc. And then chapter 8 will start kind of like a new arc. And so we'll kind of start the next stream with chapter 8. So it makes sense to kind of end the stream pretty soon. Because one of the things that, like, with these chapters, from chapter 4 to chapter 7, a lot of it is kind of this series of events that kind of happen, and just kind of talk about, like, what happened to the Ark of the Covenant and how it got back. Because it's one of those things where perhaps, back then, if you will, you hear, like, this story about how, like, well, the Ark of God was once lost to the Philistines, and then now we got it back, and then, some Israelite kid might think, well, how did that happen, right? And so, to use think of, like, in an anime, chapter 4 to chapter 7 is basically a filler, right? Because one of the funny things, too, to think about is that, like, Samuel doesn't even appear in any of these chapters, which then you can all make that joke about, how do you know about the parts you weren't there for? But anyway, I just wanted to put that side note aside, just so you know that we're going to end this video pretty soon. Unless, of course, you have questions you want to talk deeply about. But anyway, here we go, chapter 7. So the men of Kiriath Jearim went and took up the ark of the Lord, and they brought it to Abinadab's house on the hill and consecrated Eleazar his son to guard the ark of the Lord. The ark remained in Kiriath Jearim a long time, for 20 years. Then all the people of Israel turned back to the Lord. So Samuel said to all the Israelites, oh, he's back now. So Samuel said to all the Israelites, I need a voice for this guy. Sorry, I'm just blanking here because I'm like, I need to give Samuel a voice, and it has to be a consistent one because I gotta do his voice for a while. If you are returning to the Lord with all your hearts, then rid yourself of these foreign gods and the Ashtoreths, and commit yourselves to the Lord and serve him only. And he will deliver you out of the hand of the Philistines. That's right. I'm doing my David Hayter impersonation for Samuel, because Samuel's a badass, so he deserves a badass voice. So the Israelites put away their Baals and Ashtoreths, and they served the Lord only. Then Samuel said, assemble all the Israelites at Mizpah, and I will intercede with the Lord for you. When they had assembled at Mizpah, they drew water and poured it out before the Lord. And on that day they fasted, and there they confessed, we have sinned against the Lord. Now Samuel was serving as leader of Israel at Mizpah. When the Philistines heard that Israel had assembled at Mizpah, the rulers of the Philistines came up to attack them. When the Israelites heard of it, they were afraid because of the Philistines. And they said to Samuel, do not stop crying out to the Lord our God for us, that he may rescue us from the hand of the Philistines. Then Samuel took a suckling lamb and sacrificed it as a whole burnt offering to the Lord. And he cried out to the Lord on Israel's behalf, and the Lord answered him. Now while Samuel was sacrificing the burnt offering, the Philistines drew near to engage Israel in battle. It doesn't take very long to not learn your lesson. But that day the Lord thundered with loud thunder against the Philistines, and threw them into a panic that they were routed before the Israelites. The men of Israel rushed out to Mizpah and pursued the Philistines, slaughtering them along the way to a point below Beth-kar. Then Samuel took up a stone and set it up between Mizpah and Shen, and he named it Ebenezer, that's a popular name, saying, "Thus far the Lord has helped us." So the Philistines were subdued and they stopped invading Israel's territory. Now throughout Samuel's lifetime, the hand of the Lord was against the Philistines. The towns from Ekron to Gath that the Philistines had captured from Israel were restored to Israel, and Israel delivered the neighboring territory from the hands of the Philistines. And there was peace between Israel and the Amorites. Samuel continued as Israel's leader all the days of his life. From year to year, he went on a circuit from Bethel to Gilgal to Mizpah, judging Israel in all those places. But he always went back to Ramah, where his home was, and there he also held court for Israel. He built an altar there to the Lord. And that's chapter 7. So, chapter 7 reintroduces Samuel as an adult. Because remember, when we started at chapter 4, the safe assumption is that Samuel is still like a preteen or whatever, how old he was when God called him. And then God began his culling of, the current priest, right? Eli and his family. Primarily his 2 sons, anyway. And so now, chapter 7 does a massive time jump, right? What was it? The ark remained in Kiryat Jearim a long time, 20 years. And, let's make the assumption that, it was 20 years later that Samuel reappears, and we're not, taking some point in the middle of the 20 years. And if that were the case, then Samuel's, in his 30s. Maybe he's about 30. Basically, he's my age. And so, now Samuel is the leader, right? And so there's a huge transition, right? From the corrupt priestly order with Eli's sons, and now we have Samuel, right? And of course, Samuel is like this, an actual spiritual authority, right? So when Samuel tells the people, get rid of your idols and your foreign gods, and the people start doing it. And then, there's victory for the people, right? So a bunch of Philistines attack, and then Samuel's like, well, God will fight this battle for us, and God does, right? And there's a little interesting tidbit here that I'll kind of point out in a minute, but God once again uses nature to show that he is present, right? As opposed to just having the Israelites defeat the Philistines on their own, right? Which once again is a massive contrast to chapter 4, right? And how the Ark of the Covenant was kind of treated like a lucky charm. But here it is the presence of God, right? So the contrast is, the Ark of the Covenant, the perceived presence of God versus the actual presence of God, and God moves with them through the cloud, right? And then uses lightning and stuff. With that being said, a little bit of funny trivia for older, RPG players like myself. In some JRPGs, the early Final Fantasies use this. There's actually a summon monster, an Eidolon or whatever you want to call it, called Rama, and his whole thing is that he uses lightning. And Rama has a kind of a reference, perhaps, to this passage, where God uses, lightning in this story to defeat the Philistines. And of course, Samuel's hometown is Ramah, right? And Samuel spends all his time there, and so there's this connection with Ramah and lightning. And then of course, let's crank that up to like awesome fantasy RPGs and make an actual guy called Ramah who shoots lightning. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe when people were creating that character, they thought like, this is an awesome story. And why not use it? Because I mean, this is pretty cool, right? Where God routs the Philistines. Sorry, God routs the Philistines using lightning at the town of Ramah, and so just a little bit of neat trivia. But going back to chapter 7 itself, there's the huge contrast also with the Eli's family, where the presence of God has left, and then with Samuel, where the presence of God is present. Now, of course, this is extremely important, right? More important is that the presence of God is with Samuel, right? Because, as I mentioned in last week's video, I talk about how the reason why it's called the Book of Samuel, even though like later Samuel will kind of become a very minor character and actually dies halfway through his own book. As I made the claim earlier, the reason why the Book of Samuel maintains that name is because the important thing, the central theme, if you will, of the Book of Samuel is a revelation that God will give to Samuel, and it is something that must, that's the centerpiece of the Book of Samuel, is this revelation that God is going to give Samuel. So chapter 7 really solidifies God's presence with Samuel, because once again, if the central theme of the Book of Samuel is a revelation that God is going to give Samuel, then you have to really confirm that the presence of God is with Samuel, right? And that Samuel is a real prophet. Otherwise, then the main theme that God is going to give Samuel would have no real relevance, right? Because if Samuel is not a real prophet, then the revelation doesn't matter. Or more accurately, it would not even be existent, let alone matter, right? And so chapter 7, and with this transition, and I think this is why it's also a good place to end today's video on chapter 7, is because the whole point of this filler episode, if you will, is the transition of God's presence and his authority, even, from Levites who were kind of, let's say, some Levites that became entitled, right? And that was embodied in Eli's family. Sorry, there's running water noises in the background. Just gotta wait for it. You just gotta wait for it. Just gonna mute the mic while it goes off. Okay, the bulk of the noise is gone. Just gotta deal with it sometimes. But anyway, as I was saying, so the real transition is, the presence of God between, a bunch of entitled Levites, if you will, as embodied in Hophni and Phinehas, to, a guy who was previously a nobody, but is also kind of a miracle child considering the circumstances of his life. with Samuel, right? And so this transition is important because when we get to the more um, the revelation given to Samuel parts of the story, you know, there needs to be that full credibility. And you think of like, you know, how if you were a Jewish person, whether, you know, back then or even to the modern day, the revelation that God gives to Samuel is a very integral part of not just Judaism, but, you know, a centerpiece of Christianity. And in a way, it's a centerpiece of the human experience, which is a pretty, I know you're probably thinking that's a pretty bold claim, but this revelation that God is going to give Samuel is a huge deal. And so chapter 7 solidifying that like the presence of God is upon Samuel is a huge deal, which I guess is a perfect transition that we'll start with next week as we move into chapter 8 and going forward from there. Of course, you know, if you want to take a sneak peek and figure out what the major theme is, I mean, by all means. But I will cover that next week, and that is, you know, we'll continue on from chapter 8 forward. But I think chapter 7, finishing chapter 7, is a great place to end here. So with that being said, unless you have any questions, I'm just going to do some housekeeping, and then we will end the stream here. So housekeeping, super straightforward. Just kind of giving my stream schedule for the week. So Monday, I should finish Wings of Liberty, and then Wednesday I will start Heart of the Swarm for StarCraft 2. So that will be Monday at 2 o'clock Pacific time, and Wednesday at 2 o'clock Pacific time. As you know, for game streams, especially for a game like StarCraft, you kind of need more time. Of course, I mean, I might beat Wings of Liberty in less time, so I might even start like at 2:30 or something. We'll see. I'll probably just start at 2 and then end earlier. That just makes more sense. But that's kind of the plan for Monday and Wednesday. Thursday, we got a Throwback Thursday episode. So keep your eyes peeled for that. And Friday, of course, next week, we'll really dive into more of the meatier stuff of the Book of Samuel, as we will start next week with chapter 8. So that's kind of the news update of where we're going to be going, how the streams and videos will look like for next week. So TLDR, StarCraft Monday, Wednesday, 2 to 6 Pacific time, something like that. And then Wednesday, Heroes of Might and Magic 2 Throwback Thursday. And then, well, that will be an upload sometime in the afternoon. And on Friday, it will be reading the Book of Samuel, starting from chapter 8. And that will be at 3 o'clock next Friday. So with that being said, this is going to be the end of the stream. Hope you guys enjoyed the Book of Samuel. And I will see you guys next time, either on Monday, or if you guys are only here for the reading streams, I'll see you guys next Friday. And I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Hope you guys have a great weekend. And God bless you.